This week we're reading two poems by William Blake from his collection Songs of Innocence and Experience. And we'll be reading some more poems by Blake later in this course. So I wanted to just give you a brief background into this text. First of all, Blake was himself originally a visual artist, but he disliked most of the visual art of the 18th century because he believed that the purpose of art was to depict spiritual truths rather than simply to please the senses. For him, the role of the artist was to be a prophet who challenged political and religious injustices. So most of his work was a combination of visual art and poetic prophecy. And he did write some very explicitly prophetic works as well. With the onset of the French Revolution, Blake associated with some of the foremost English radicals like William Godwin, Richard Price, and Tom Paine. So the songs clearly come out of a revolutionary moment, but it's important to recognize that Blake was more than just politically radical. As the songs show, his outrage at the English political system was far-reaching and strongly attacked organized religion and all systems of thought that he felt restricted human freedom. The Songs of Innocence were written first and initially issued in a series by themselves in 1789. He finished the Songs of Experience in 1794, but issued them only in conjunction with the Songs of Innocence. But interestingly, he continued to issue both Innocence and Experience separately as well. So as much as the two sets clearly speak to one another, it's also worth noting that he didn't see them as necessarily depending on one another. It's also worth noting that 4 of the songs that were initially published in Songs of Innocence eventually became Songs of Experience when he finished the later group. So that in itself should suggest how fluid the boundary between these two categories is. And in many ways, all of the poems are about a border area between the two categories of innocence and experience. You'll note that I haven't used the word publish when talking about these poems because they weren't published in the conventional sense of the word. Rather, they were issued as illuminated etchings complete with pictorial designs. That means that he produced each single copy individually and separately, not on a printing press. And that in itself adds complications to our readings of the poems because we have 28 different copies of the combined volume that still survive, and amongst those 19 different arrangements of the songs. So if we want to read them as a series, we have to keep in mind that it's a very fluid and changeable series. But most importantly, it means that Blake's original readers would not have read the poems as we are doing, as text typed onto a page, but as handwritten etchings with illustrations. And that means that your interpretations of these poems may change when you see not just the words, but the way that they were presented. In many cases, the illustrations seem to run counter to the text, or at least do not obviously explicate the text. So in the case of the poems we're reading, we have the lamb, in which the images clearly reflect the subject matter of the poem, and the tiger, in which again we have a tiger illustrating the poem, although we might ask whether that tiger is the tiger we would imagine when we read the poem. Or whether it seems to suggest other things than what is actually written in the text. But the most important thing I want to talk about is Blake's concepts of innocence and experience. It's significant, first of all, that Blake opposes innocence not to guilt or sin, which is what we would probably expect, but to experience, which implies experience implies a knowledge of the ways of the world rather than any conscious wrongdoing. And in his title page, Blake calls innocence and experience the two contrary states of the human soul. So as much as we might think of experience as being imposed by external forces, Blake's also suggesting it's more about the attitude of soul that is thereby created. So on the one hand, Blake insists that we're dealing with contraries, but on the other, he also shows how very close to one another these two states of the soul can be. The speakers of the songs of innocence, for example, are very often children, or at least childlike, but the subjects of those poems very often verge on the borderline of experience. The poems will often ask us to fill in the world of experience of which the speaker is unaware, but the reader is obviously expected to know. So there's a tension between the speaker of the poem and how the reader is necessarily supposed to understand it. There's very often a level of irony in those poems. Experience, on the other hand, in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake writes that without contraries is no progression, or opposition is true friendship. So if innocence and experience are contraries, they also have to be seen as intimately connected and part of the same process. So one question we might ask is experience in some ways a necessary phase of the development of the growth of the soul? And as we read through the poems, I think we will see precisely how ambiguous Blake makes the line between innocence and experience, as well as how he troubles the question of whether innocence or experience is the determinative factor. For example, if we go back to the title page of the combined songs, we see at the bottom of the page Adam and Eve being expelled from paradise. But then we also see an upward soaring bird towards the top of the page, which might suggest an alternative point of view. So as we go through these poems, I would suggest that you think about the precise ways in which experience is represented as valuable and necessary. And in this week, in the case of the tiger, what does the tiger stand for, and what value does the tiger bring that perhaps the lamb doesn't? Blake's religious symbolism is thus clearly far from Orthodox Christianity, and we can see in both sets of poems that organized religion is the subject of much of his criticism. Blake was very much opposed to the traditional views of God as a distant lawgiver, the old man with the white beard in the sky. He felt that was a very oppressive vision of the human condition, whereby the worst qualities of humanity were upheld as the rules we should live by. This famous image very much identifies that vision of God with the rationalist human vision of the world associated with the Enlightenment of the 18th century and Isaac Newton in particular. By giving God such a concrete form, Blake felt humanity destroys its divine part. So instead of God as a stern father figure, Blake posits a progression through the triad of child, father, and Christ, representing innocence, experience, and then perhaps a higher level of innocence, an innocence that can only be reached by passing through the world of experience. And that's very much what the two poems, the Lamb and the Tiger, are about. So as you read those poems, think about them in the context of what I've just said about Blake himself.